Hi everyone and welcome back to Snippet Sports Science, proudly sponsored by Eliteform. If you're into your velocity-based training, make sure you check them out at eliteform.com. And if you're into your podcasts, Eliteform actually have their own podcast at the moment, and you can just search Eliteform through Spotify or iTunes and you can catch their podcast. So you'll hear Skip talking to lots of different coaches and professionals in a whole host of different areas and talking about podcasts. If you enjoy this style of podcasting, short, sharp, and to the point, I actually run another podcast called BFR Radio, which I go through all things blood flow restriction, and you can also find that on iTunes or Spotify. Back to this series of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed the introductory podcast that I did on isometric training. I actually found this really interesting myself because I've been doing a little bit of training with it personally, but also with some of the athletes that I train. And so therefore it was a good refresher. And in some cases I learned a fair bit. And the information I got from that was out of a really great textbook called Specific Strength Training Manual for Coaches. It's probably a classic strength and conditioning manual for most coaches and has really great information about all things strength training. So if you actually haven't read it, it's worthwhile getting out and actually having it in your library as a permanent collection. Just to refresh your memory, I want to go through a few important notes from this textbook about isometric training, which will lead into today's article. And in case today's article gets a little bit too long, I may actually decide to cut it in half and actually push this over 2 episodes just to keep this in this nice, short, sharp format. Just as a little refresher, we need to remember that the bulk of the data points to isometric training to be more efficient than dynamic training, particularly for those sport disciplines in which the external opposition in the competition is high. Whereas in sports which require high-speed movements against low external opposition, isometric training is less efficient than just dynamic training by itself. If we point to the positives of isometric training, it's simple to set up and the equipment is also quite simple as well. There's a local effect according to the muscle group and the joint angles, and that's probably a really big take-home there. It requires less time and energy than traditional dynamic strength training, and it also can assist with visual and kinesthetic memorization of movement images when compared to dynamic strength regimes. So if you're trying to get that transfer of certain positions from training in the gym into the sport, this is where isometric training can really lend to some major benefits. With respect to isometric regimes, there's 2 main types. The first one is an explosive isometric, and this is where there's an emphasis on speed of tension development, up to a maximum around 80-90% of maximal exertion. And this assists in the development of explosive and starting strength. The second type of regime is the not explosive isometric. And this is about the achievement of a given magnitude of strength effort without time limits and maintains the level of tension as long as possible. And this assists with the development of maximal strength and the static strength endurance. Like when we compare this to normal dynamic strength training, when we use repetition and RM to change whether we're doing maximal strength or explosive strength, here you can use the type of tension development, whether it's quick, short and sharp or long, and up to what kind of percentage of maximal exertion. One of the issues with isometric training, I think we can all realize if you don't have the great equipment of force plates and so forth, is quantifying the loads and the magnitude of strength effort. And one solution that I think is a really handy hint is to hold a determined weight for a given period of time. The training effect of isometric exercise depends on the joint angles, and specific strength adaptations appears to occur according to the joint angle trained. However, it seemed to be there's a general rule. It appears that the long muscle lengths are better than shorter. In other words, they're more specific joint angles. Therefore, if you need to train a whole range or a spectrum of angles, you may actually have to do multiple isometric holds, or from what I seem to have read in the text here, that long muscle lengths seem to be more beneficial than shorter muscle lengths. Overall, some guidelines for isometric training. You need to be aware of these joint positions due to strength adaptations are specific to what is trained. Isometric training is more effective when competition exercises require high levels of strength. Long application of isometric exercises lead to significant expansion of the connective tissue. Therefore, the muscle elasticity decreases. And as a result, it's important to ensure that you get your athletes to perform relaxation or dynamic stretching exercises of moderate intensity between sets and or at the end of the isometric training. There was a couple of ideas around combined regimes that you could actually incorporate isometric with more dynamic type resistance exercises. And there was two main ones here. The first one was a static dynamic regime, and we talked about quasi-isometric exercises. This is the pushing version or a holding version. And the second one within the static dynamic regime was the explosive static dynamic exercises. And this is where you can either develop explosive and high-speed strength or explosive and maximal strength. And the difference between the high-speed strength and the maximal strength more comes around not to the load that you will hold during the isometric contraction, which is around that 80% for about 5 to 6 seconds, but it's the subsequent dynamic work. So to develop high-speed strength, you would find a way of decreasing the load for the subsequent dynamic work effort, which is around 50 to 60%. Whereas if you're trying to develop maximal strength, you would try to move the bar at a maximal speed, but keeping the same loading of around 70 to 80% of maximum. And the third regime within the static dynamic regime was this thing called a tear regime, which I'd never heard before. And this is where muscles are slowly stretched in the isometric regime until an approximate level of 70 to 80% of maximum. And at this point, the external resistance is suddenly eliminated to a very low percentage of around 30 to 40%. This requires a special device, but as I said in the last podcast, one example would be is you're pushing maximally against, say, a really heavy prowler, and that load or a person just pretty much jumps off and the person just explodes and accelerates. And the second type of regime within a combined resistance and isometric type program is the slow dynamic exercises with a reduced amplitude of movements. And this involves where you have an overload weight of around 10 to 40% of RM, and you perform them within a limited range of movement, say, for example, between 90 to 110 degrees. So although I tried to go through that really quickly, I've realized I've gone on for quite some time, but I hope that was a good reminder of what I spoke about in the last podcast. And it's just a good little refresher for the next article, which I'm going to go through. Therefore, from that quick refresher, I'm going to jump straight into the article, and it's called The Scientific Basis for Eccentric Quasi-Isometric Resistance Training, a Narrative Review. It appeared in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research in 2019 and comes from a group of authors out of Auckland in New Zealand. And after I read this review, I think it really rolled in quite well from the previous article or the previous podcast. And I'm really just going to jump straight into it and just trying to pick out the best bits and pieces. With respect to this review, eccentric quasi-isometrics will be defined as holding a position until isometric failure or maximally resisting the subsequent eccentric phase. Theoretically, the prolonged quasi-isometric and eccentric component enabled a large accumulation of mechanical tension and metabolic stress that would contribute to improvements in work capacity, muscle size, and connective tissue health. While traditional high-intensity isometric contractions and eccentric muscle actions are commonly used by practitioners with well-established value in the modern scientific literature, eccentric quasi-isometrics remain relatively unexplored. Therefore, this review was aimed to synthesize and critically analyze relevant research and subsequently developed a rationale for the value of eccentric quasi-isometric training and highlight the potential areas for future research. Firstly, let's just redefine what eccentric quasi-isometric training is. This refers to as prior to the eccentric quasi-isometric contraction, a submaximal being hereafter relative to 1 repetition maximum. Eccentric contraction where the muscle tendon unit undergoes an active lengthening is performed. Once the prescribed joint position is met, the trainee shifts to yielding isometric muscle action and attempts to hold the position for as long as possible. The final phase occurs as fatigue accumulates and an eccentric contraction commences while the trainee attempts to resist muscle lengthening maximally. Some practitioners contend that this second lengthening phase places additional stretch and strain on the musculotendinous system similar to supramaximal eccentric training. Practitioners have recommended a wide range of loads with the goal of holding the quasi-isometric contraction for 5 to 90 seconds. Consistent with traditional resistance training, greater intensities and shorter contraction durations are recommended for strength and power athletes, while lower loads and longer contractions may be advantageous for oxidative or rehabilitative purposes. Anecdotally, increased muscle thickness, improved range of movement, altered force angle relationships, and improved tendon health have been reported following eccentric quasi-isometric training. Continuing the understanding of the morphological adaptations around eccentric quasi-isometric training, This appears to be a valuable tool for targeting specific musculotendinous morphological adaptations such as increased muscle thickness and fascicle length and tendon stiffness and elasticity. Functional morphology refers to the structure and function of organisms and their specific structural features. Although morphology affects function in all tissues, this review will focus on the musculoskeletal system, which is often broken down into the three-component model of force transmission. The three-component model provides insight into the determinants of force production and transmission, where the first one is the contractile element, the CE, the series elastic component, SEC, and the parallel elastic component, PEC. The parallel elastic component is synonymous with the extracellular matrix and includes the elastic tissues surrounding myofibrils. This is the endo, peri, and epimysium, as well as the sarcolemma and the fascia. These tissues are thought to contribute to the sensations of pressure and, although yet to be fully quantified, may yet play a meaningful role in force transmission between the joints and the body segment. The series elastic component encompasses the spring-like tissues in series with actin and myosin, the tendon and aponeurosis being the most obvious. Controversy exists regarding the exact function of the titin myofilament, which appears to play a role in both active and passive force transmission. Finally, the contractile element consists of the myofibril, and more specifically the myofilaments of actin and myosin, where myofibril is a muscle fiber. With respect to muscle length and joint angle, typically prescribed at long muscle lengths and often held through full range of movements, eccentric quasi-isometrics fulfill the scientifically based criteria of mechanical stretch and tension for improving muscular hypertrophy and function. Produced by force generation and stretch, mechanical tension is effective in promoting muscular hypertrophy regardless of the contraction type. Animal models suggest that loaded stretching may provide a unique stimulus for inducing gene transcription and muscular hypertrophy. With respect to maximum voluntary isometric contractions, recently loaded stretch training with human subjects have grown in popularity. For example, following 6 weeks of loaded, this is 20 to 40% of maximum voluntary contraction stretching for 5 3-minute sessions per week, showed that fascicle length, range of movement, and muscle thickness significantly increased, where fascicle length increased 25%, range of movement 15%, and muscle thickness 5.6%, while the pronation angle of the lateral gastroc significantly decreased at 7.1%. However, in this study, no change in maximum voluntary isometric contractions or voluntary activation was present, despite several cross-sectional investigations supporting the relationship between muscle architecture and performance. Taking this and other studies into consideration, it appears that in young males, loaded stretching can provide sufficient stimulus to affect musculotendinous architecture, viscoelastic properties, and likely acute pain thresholds. As variants of loaded stretching utilize extended periods at or near end of range of movement, the results of the aforementioned research lends credence to the hypothesis that eccentric quasi-isometric training may be a valuable training methodology for improving acute and chronic flexibility and musculotendinous function. However, there is dearth of stretch research elucidating the ideal stretching intensity and the efficacy of loaded stretching to improve muscular or athletic performance. Putting on my practical strength and conditioning cap here as a coach, some of the athletes that I work with, I've actually started to give them Bulgarian squats where they're actually got to hold a stretch for a period of time. And personally from myself, and I think from their end as well, is that they can really feel that long stretch that is sometimes actually quite hard to achieve with personal stretching as well. I think I'm getting a couple of things here. I'm getting a really good stretch through their musculotendinous structures, but they're also getting quite a good pre-activation, I guess could be a good way of saying it, prior to their actual main session as well. Little side point there. Back to the point around maximum voluntary isometric contractions. Although eccentric muscle actions have had the highest potential for muscle force production, isometric muscle actions are the only contraction type that has no range of movement dependent endpoint. Isometric training is also easily implemented as simply flexing, such as contracting the agonist and the antagonist of a limb, which can increase muscle size and strength in active men. Although the value of co-contraction training in well-trained population has yet to be found. And that's probably one important thing to do when you're doing isometric training, if especially at body weight, is not just to sit in the position, but really think about that co-contraction of both the agonist and the antagonist of a limb. It's a little hard to first get the athletes to understand it, but once they've got it, they really understand that this increases the intensity of the isometric contraction. Additionally, isometric contractions enable training at specific joint angles and therefore muscle tendon lengths. While strength improvements are joint angle specific, increases in muscle hypertrophy, which is larger following full range of movement and long muscle length training, transfers to all joint angles. For example, in one study, they compared the effects of dynamic resistance training executed with full or partial range of movement. The full range of movement group experienced significant greater improvements in the distal anatomical cross-sectional area, fascicle length, and isometric force at all 7 measured knee joint angles when compared to the partial range of movement group. Although isometric contractions resulted in less muscle damage and less dramatic muscular tennis adaptations compared to maximal eccentrics, maximal voluntary isometric contractions at long muscle lengths increased markers of acute muscle damage and soreness relative to maximum voluntary isometric contractions at short muscle lengths despite lower torque outputs. This would potentially make sense if you've got something at a long muscle length. It's going to be a lot harder on the whole body as something that's quite short and you would think would be actually easier to hold. However, as the research is starting to say, and as I alluded to in the first podcast, training at the longer muscle lengths, although you potentially have lower torque outputs during the training, it has a greater transfer across all joint angles after the training effect has taken place. Isometric training at long muscle lengths produces greater hypertrophy, force production at different joint angles, and dynamic performance benefits compared to training at shorter muscle lengths following longer-term trials. In a recent systematic review into the effects of isometric training variables, one author determined that isometric training at long muscle lengths produced greater increases in muscle hypertrophy than volume-equated short muscle length training. And this is likely due to increased mechanical tension throughout all tissues involved in the force transmission. From a muscular architectural viewpoint, the larger architectural and functional adaptations following long muscle length training might be due, at least in part, to the greater degree of fascicle strength, which results in increased muscle damage and sarcomere compliance, demonstrated by acute optimal angle shifts towards longer muscle lengths. Therefore, there's evidence to support the principle that mechanical tension can increase muscle volume and that isometric training at long muscle lengths leads to greater hypertrophy and a shift in the optimal angle. Referring to the body of evidence around contraction intensity and duration, cumulative tension and total workload are key determinants of hypertrophic adaptation regardless of the contraction type. Morphological adaptations to isometric resistance training are similar between work-match high and low-intensity training. While much of the literature recommends high load over low load resistance training for strength development, many periodization models emphasize muscular hypertrophy and general muscular endurance early in a macro or mesocycle. Accordingly, eccentric quasi-isometric training emphasizing time under tension with the application of practitioner-recommended intensities of 30 to 80% of 1RM may be a useful training method to alter muscle size. Referring to the metabolic factors affecting isometric training, total time under tension, acute hypoxia, and metabolic stress are mechanisms that contribute to morphological adaptations. Several studies have reported significant reductions in oxygen availability from subsequent isometric contractions at 30 to 50% of MVC. Isometric contractions at 60% of maximal voluntary isometric contraction result in greater short-term blood flow restriction relative to 30 and 100% of MVIC, as the moderate intensity contraction could be sustained for a significantly greater duration than 100%, while the tension created by the 30% contraction was not enough to reduce blood flow and metabolite clearance. These occlusive effects have several potential effects, including increased metabolite buildup and post-contraction blood flow, both of which stimulate muscle hypertrophy. I've said this before in the podcast, is that this sounds a bit like BFR. Gentile et al. Found that both isometric contractions and vascular occlusion resulted in greater blood lactate responses, which can increase muscle cell myogenesis, satellite cell activation, and phosphorylation of mTOR. Additionally, acute ischemia combined with low-intensity muscular contraction can significantly increase growth hormone, IGF-1, and mechanogrowth factor production, which are physiological responses to decreased muscle and blood pH. Occlusion may also help to bypass the size principle by reducing the amount of oxygen available for the oxidative type 1 motor units. resulting in preferential recruitment of fast-twitch fibers at relative low intensities. Long-term morphological adaptations to blood flow restriction training include increased muscle thickness and function in a variety of training circumstances. And this is also specifically referring to the slow dynamic exercise reduced amplitude of movements where they're performed of a period of 30 to 40 seconds duration, 3 to 4 sets, with the same sort of rest period where you're trying to get that accumulation of metabolites through that partial range of movement and that constant slow tempo. Though sparse, a few studies have examined the effect of blood flow metabolites during isometric training. One group of authors compared the metabolic response and adaptations to short, which is 4 sets of 10 3 seconds contractions, or long 4 contractions of 30-second duration isometric contractions as 70% of maximum voluntary contraction. Although blood flow was not measured, the long contraction limbs experienced greater changes in metabolites and larger decreases in pH. In the study, muscle thickness also significantly increased in the upper 10% and lower 11% portions of the quadriceps in the long contraction group, but not the short contraction limb. Although exercise-induced muscle damage is not needed to promote muscular hypertrophy, emerging research suggests that exercise-induced muscle damage may play some role in morphological adaptations. When exposed to a novel stimulus, acute myofibril, muscle fiber, microtrauma occurs as an abundance of calcium enters and remains in the muscle fiber. Eccentric muscle actions typically result in a greater degree of acute trauma as evidenced by elevated serum creatine kinase, myoglobin, and skeletal troponin 1 levels, and delayed onset muscle soreness. These markers typically coincide with a temporary reduction in muscle force and power. While detrimental to short-term performance, exercise-induced muscle damage is associated with changes in a variety of chemokinins that attract inflammatory cells, which influence muscle hypertrophy remodeling associated with phagocytes, free radical production, and circulating cytokinins and growth factors. Additionally, a novel delayed onset muscle soreness induced stimulus may lead to increased sarcoplasmic reticulum reuptake of this calcium by altering T-tubal structure and increasing the concentrations of proteins. These proteins function to promote debris clearance and increase concentrations of IGF-1, fibroblast growth factor, nerve growth factor, and interleukin-6, which increase satellite cell proliferation and rates of protein and collagen synthesis, all positive things. Although acute increases in myofibril protein synthesis do not necessarily correlate with long-term hypertrophy, these increased synthesis rates theoretically result in thicker, stronger tissues that are less susceptible to future damage. The repeat bout effects refers to the substantial reduction in muscle damage from subsequent training. While most commonly observed following eccentric training, the protective effects have also been found to occur following isometric exercise, especially at long muscle lengths. Isometric training at long muscle lengths results in greater delayed onset muscle soreness and acute performance decrements, as well as chronic adaptations compared to isometrics at shorter muscle lengths. And that's where I'm going to leave today's podcast. We've covered a fair bit there with respect to the contractile element and some real basics around isometrics that further build on from the initial podcast. Join me in 1 week time. I know we've pushed this out to a fortnightly format, but just to keep this continuing, I'm going to release the second part of this article next week, just so you can get a good flow on, and then we'll go back to our fortnightly format. Thanks for listening, and make sure you join me in 1 week time. And also thank you to Elite Form for sponsoring the podcast. See you in a week's time.